The wind howled through the empty fields as Jacob pulled into his driveway. Something felt off. His farm, his land, had always been untouched, isolated. But today, something was different.
Comment below. Where are you watching from?
Then he saw it. A bright yellow notice nailed to his barn door. His stomach tightened. He stepped out of his truck, boots crunching against the dirt, and ripped the paper off the wood. His eyes scanned the words. Per HOA regulations, access to communal resources, including water rights, must comply with community guidelines. Failure to comply will result in legal penalties. Jacob's grip tightened. Communal resources? His well, his irrigation system, his farm. His land sat on a natural underground water supply, one he had owned and maintained for years. Now the HOA was claiming they had control over it. They weren't just trying to take from him. They were trying to own him. Jacob didn't go inside. He didn't call anyone. He got back in his truck, threw it into gear, and drove straight to the HOA office. The moment he stepped inside, the receptionist barely looked up. "Can I help you?" she said, bored. Jacob slapped the notice onto the counter. "Who approved this?" She blinked at the paper, then sighed. "You'll need to speak with Mr. Langston." Of course, Gregory Langston, HOA president. Jacob exhaled, slow, controlled, dangerous. "Then get him," he said. A few minutes later, Langston strolled in, grinning. "Mr. Holloway," he mused, arms crossed, "did you get our notice?" Jacob's jaw flexed. "You don't own my water." Langston chuckled. "Legally, that's complicated." Jacob's pulse slowed. He'd seen men like Langston before. Greedy, power-hungry, convinced they were untouchable. Langston leaned forward, smirking. "Look, I know change is hard for some folks," he said, "but you live on HOA land, and under our jurisdiction, resources need to be shared for the community's benefit." Jacob felt his teeth grind. His farm had been in his family for generations. The HOA didn't even exist when it was built. Now they were trying to rewrite history. Langston clapped a hand on his shoulder, a little too hard. "Don't take it personally, Holloway," he said, voice dripping with arrogance. "We just need cooperation from everyone." Jacob didn't move, didn't blink. Then he smiled, a slow, knowing smile, because Langston thought he had won. And that meant he had no idea what Jacob was about to do. Jacob didn't argue, didn't threaten, he just smiled. A slow, knowing, dangerous smile. Langston took it as a sign of defeat. "Glad to see you're coming around," the HOA president mused. "We'll be sending over the official paperwork soon. Just a formality." Jacob gave a small nod. Like he agreed. Then he turned and walked out, because Langston had no idea. Jacob wasn't just any homeowner. He was sitting on a legal time bomb, and now it was about to go off. Jacob drove straight home, walked past the ruined notice, past the barn, into his house, and Akito, straight to the safe. His hands moved quickly, unlocking the heavy steel door, pulling out an old leather folder. Inside, the original land deed, yellowed with age, signed decades ago, and right there, buried in the fine print, a clause the HOA had never seen. Decades before the HOA even existed, Jacob's great-grandfather had secured exclusive rights to the underground water supply. The next morning, Langston sent over the paperwork, an official HOA contract demanding control over Jacob's water. Jacob signed it immediately, but not the way they expected. Instead, he added a single handwritten note at the bottom. "This agreement is null and void under the 1948 Holloway Water Rights Clause." Then, he mailed it straight to the county courthouse and sat back, because Langston was about to get the worst phone call of his life. Permanently non-transferable, non-negotiable, which meant the HOA had no legal claim. None. Jacob exhaled, his smirk growing. Langston thought he had Jacob trapped, but he just walked into a legal minefield, and the best part? Jacob wasn't going to warn him. He was going to let him dig his own grave. 3 days later, Jacob was in his workshop when he heard the tires. Fast, aggressive, desperate. He stepped outside just as Langston's black SUV skidded to a stop in his driveway. The HOA president stormed out, face red, eyes burning. "How you think this is funny?" he snapped. Jacob didn't move, didn't blink, just leaned against his truck, arms crossed. "Something wrong, Mr. Langston." Langston threw a crumpled letter at him. Jacob caught it, unfolded it, and scanned the words. The county's ruling. The HOA's claim was invalid. They had no legal control over Jacob's land, and any attempt to enforce their demand would be considered trespassing. Jacob smirked. Too easy. He looked up at Langston, waiting for the meltdown, and it came. Langston stepped closer. Too close. His voice dropped, low and venomous. "You think you're untouchable?" he hissed. "You think a piece of paper protects you?" Jacob raised an eyebrow. Langston's jaw tightened. Then the real threat started. "You need to reconsider," he said. "Because accidents happen, Holloway." Jacob's smirk vanished. Langston took another step. "Fires start. Livestock gets poisoned. Wells dry up overnight." Jacob's fingers curled into fists. There it was. "And if you think the county can protect you," Langston scoffed. "Good luck, we have friends everywhere." Jacob inhaled slowly, steady, controlled. Because Langston had just made the worst mistake of his life, Jacob reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and showed Langston exactly what he had just recorded. Every word, every illegal demand, every veiled threat, captured in crystal-clear audio. Langston's face drained of color, because he knew this wasn't just a dispute anymore, this was a criminal case. And now, he wasn't just facing a lawsuit, he was facing prison. Langston didn't move, didn't breathe. The phone in Jacob's hand might as well have been a loaded gun. The HOA president's threats, fires, poisoned livestock, dried-up wells, were all crystal clear, recorded, time-stamped. And now, they weren't just words, they were evidence. Langston tried to recover. His smirk returned, weaker this time. "You're making a mistake, Holloway," he sneered. "You think a recording is enough to—" Jacob's thumb tapped the screen. "Play." Langston's own voice hissed back at him. "Accidents happen, Holloway. Fires start. Wells dry up overnight." The sound of his own threat filled the air. Langston's face turned to stone. Jacob didn't say a word, didn't need to. Instead, he just slid his phone back into his pocket, like he wasn't even worried. Then, he walked away, because now it was time to bury the HOA. Jacob wasted no time. He sent 3 copies of the recording, one to his lawyer, one to the county commissioner, one to a local investigative reporter. By the next morning, the HOA's crimes were everywhere. News headlines exploded. HOA president caught on tape making violent threats. Illegal HOA land seizures under investigation. Could this be the end of Willow Creek HOA? And just like that, the entire community turned against Langston. Langston called an emergency HOA meeting. It didn't go how he expected. Half the board members didn't even show up. The few that did, terrified. "Did you really threaten Holloway? Do you have any idea what you've done? We could all go to jail for this, Greg." Langston tried to control the panic. "This is nothing," he snapped. "We just need to—" But before he could finish, the doors slammed open. 2 men in dark suits walked in, badges glinted under the fluorescent lights. One of them spoke first. "Gregory Langston, FBI. We need to have a word." Langston's face turned white. The HOA members, silent. Frozen, terrified, because now, this wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a federal investigation. Jacob sat on his porch that evening, sipping his coffee when he saw them. Black SUVs, flashing lights. Langston, dragged out of his house in handcuffs. Neighbors gathered, some whispered. Sam filmed, Jacob just watched, calm, unbothered, because Langston wasn't coming back from this, and the HOA. It wasn't just collapsing, it was burning to the ground. Langston was gone, but the HOA still existed. And Jacob, he wasn't finished yet. Because ruining one man wasn't enough. The entire system needed to collapse, and when Jacob was done, the HOA wouldn't just be bankrupt, They'd owe him everything. The morning after Langston's arrest, Jacob walked into his lawyer's office, dropped a thick folder onto the desk. His lawyer, Mark Hanley, raised an eyebrow. Jacob smirked. Time to finish this. Inside the folder, a class-action lawsuit. Multiple homeowners had been illegally fined. Dozens had been forced into fraudulent payments. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into secret HOA accounts. And the best part? With Langston gone, there was no one left to cover it up. Mark scanned the documents, then exhaled. Slow. Impressed. This isn't just a lawsuit, Jacob. He looked up. This is going to destroy them. Jacob's smile didn't fade. That was the point. The remaining board members panicked. They tried to replace Langston, tried to convince homeowners the lawsuit was exaggerated. But then, the county ordered a full audit, and within days the truth came out. Over $750,000 in mismanaged funds, fake maintenance fees, hidden accounts, and illegal land claims. Records proving they had used HOA money for personal luxuries. Now, the board wasn't just facing a lawsuit, they were facing bankruptcy. The last remaining HOA board members called for a private meeting, and they begged Jacob to attend. He walked into the HOA office for the last time, saw the desperate faces of the people who once thought they owned him. One of them, sweating through his shirt, cleared his throat. "Look, Jacob, we can work something out." Jacob leaned back, arms crossed, silent, letting them sweat. Finally, one of them broke. "How much do you want to make this go away?" Jacob exhaled, shaking his head. They still didn't get it, so he leaned forward, voice calm, cold, final. "I don't want your money." They blinked, confused. Jacob smiled. "I want the HOA, every last piece of it." They had no choice. Within a week, the HOA was officially dissolved. Every illegally charged fine was refunded. Jacob's land was now 100% outside their jurisdiction, and the final blow? Jacob bought their headquarters and turned it into a community center. Langston's old office, now a farmer's market. Jacob stood on the front steps, watching the HOA's old empire become something useful. His mother walked up beside him, hands in her pockets. She smirked. "Think they learned their lesson?" Jacob exhaled, calm, satisfied. They won't make the same mistake again. And with that, the war was over, and Jacob had taken everything.